Mary Jane from the Digital Weed News podcast. We're focusing on the production model and mostly on adult use of cannabis, as it is also possible to list country regulations from most to least restrictive. I'm picking up from the last recording. Please go and listen to the Digital Weed News podcast. I promise to do a read through. You can go and listen from section 1. Please remember to share, like, and introduce it to people who are cannabis neutral or uninformed about cannabis, especially policymakers in government. So, going through this list, we're on page 19 of section 1.4.2, current international trends. So, firstly, we have prohibition of all production, supply and use. Well, South Africa and most of the world. Then what about prohibition in production and supply alongside legal production and supply for medicinal use? More than 50% of US states, Canada, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Germany, Ireland and others have prohibition of production and supply. Then prohibition in production and supply, decriminalization of possession for personal use. This includes 16 US states, various Latin European countries, and South Africa. 4. Prohibition of production and supply, with decriminalization of possession for personal use and some retail sales. Then we have Dutch coffee shop model, some localized informal models around the world. Number 5, prohibition of production and supply with decriminalization of small-scale personal cultivation and cannabis social clubs. Within that, we've got Belgium, Spain, the Netherlands, and Switzerland doing that. Then what about regulated legal production and supply entirely under government monopoly? Do you know that no cannabis examples, but this is the case to a large extent with most controlled drug regulations, example in Russia. Then we have regulated legal production and supply for medical and non-medical use with a mix of commercial and government monopoly elements. That's Uruguay and Canada. Then we've got regulated legal production and supply for medical and non-medical use, licensed producers and or licensed vendors. That includes Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, California, Washington DC, and a number of states with their cannabis laws under review. And then lastly, a free market model. Well, even though the options mentioned for South Africa often look like a combination of 8 and 9, which is regulated legal production supply for medical and non-medical use, or number 9, a free market model, relying on elements taken from number 4 and 5, which is prohibition of production and supply and prohibition of production and supply with decriminalization of possession, small-scale personal cultivation, and some retail stores and cannabis clubs. It is clear that a uniquely South African regulation model is needed rather than an approach to copying the imperfections of other countries, pioneering of timid, partial legal regulations. But it is also because South Africa is well placed to be one of the pioneering traditional cannabis-producing countries when it comes to legally regulated cannabis. Neither the Netherlands, Uruguay, the United States or Canada have the long-standing traditions of the use of cannabis that we have. South Africa's apartheid history is well known internationally, and we live with the consequences of that history every day. For example, South Africa was the country who suggested to the League of Nations in 1925 that cannabis should be included in the list of banned substances in 1925. Did you know that? Of all countries, South Africa has had no excuse for implementing regulations that look like Prohibition 2.0 and continue to hamper the rights of its citizens or violate its traditions and history. Given our history and irrefutable evidence that the prohibition of cannabis has been used as an instrument of oppression, South Africa needs cannabis laws and regulations to take all of the evidence into account, from the historical to the scientific, because the South African context requires it. These regulations may end up being the most liberal and the most human rights centered in the world. Now that's something to be proud of, right? Our African neighbors. In 2017, Lesotho became the first African nation to issue licenses permitting the cultivation of cannabis for medical and research purposes, followed by Zimbabwe early in 2018 and Uganda in April 2019. Cannabis remains illegal for the citizens of all three countries, and this means that Basotho, Zimbabwean and Ugandan people are not allowed to use, possess or cultivate cannabis, nor are they allowed to access cannabis products for their own benefits, whether industrial, traditional, religious, medicinal or adult use. Despite the grantings of these medical and research cultivation licenses in these countries, we remain skeptical as to the benefits to the local population. For instance, Lesotho citizens continue to be arrested on the streets and in their homes, whilst large quantities of cannabis cross the border every day into South Africa. In Zimbabwe, unlicensed growing or possession could carry a 12-year prison sentence. Employment and community-based opportunities for locals are limited due to the fact that GMP-certified grow facilities are often highly automated, thus reducing the need for physical labor. GMP certifications are required in order for the final product to be used as an active pharmaceutical ingredient. There is conflicting information about the cost and entry requirements of licensing, all of which exclude locals due to the high costs of compliance. Example, security measures or sterile packaging rooms. For example, in Zimbabwe, a license initially costed $50,000, but was later changed to an initial fee of $10,000 with a balance of $40,000 payable on a successful application. While we understand the strict regulations required for producing registered medicine, this should not be the only value, as there are too many barriers to entry for local cultivators and traders. There are grey areas with regard to trade and export of the final product. Neither African country mentioned above has regulations in place to allow its own citizens to trade in or consume cannabis. This means there's a lot of opportunity in not allowing individuals and SMEs to benefit from the global cannabis movement. Lost opportunity. Global demand for land-raised strains has made African cannabis genetics extremely valuable to seed breeders. Strains that have been grown for generations in all parts of Africa are now being exported across the world, most often with no benefit to the local communities who have been tending these genetics for generations. I'm going to leave it there. In the next recording, we'll be moving on to section 2, leaving no one behind. We talk about the 6 mandatory ethical principles for fair regulations. Thank you for listening. Go to the Digital Weed News podcast for the next recordings and to catch up on any of the past recordings, and look forward to more.